Good vibrations.
Welcome to episode 148, and today is a subject that will be a delicate one for some, for reasons that will become clear. It's not the first time we've addressed such topics on this show, and as ever, people should be mindful of not shooting the messenger. If people want to get mad, they can get mad at the people and the organisations that cause these things to happen, not those who, with all good intent, let you know it's going on. So that disclaimer out of the way, let's bring on my guest for this episode, a dude that I met in New York when I was out for the Shoot the Moon event, Crow 777 and Jason's screening of their documentary, and there were some other speakers on the bill. I was one of them, and so was this guy, Wayne McRoy. Welcome on, Wayne.
Hi, Mark. Good to be on. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
No worries. So you delivered a fascinating talk at that event on what you perceive to be a link between the autism epidemic and the incoming transhumanist artificial intelligence agenda. You've put out a book on it. So, it's quite a heavy subject. And I believe you've been on this research path for some time now, and this subject has hit very close to home for you. Maybe you just want to start by letting the audience know what you were doing before you got into all of this and what engaged you on this path of research.
Okay, well, basically, when it comes down to it, I'm just a normal, regular guy living life, and I'm seeing things going on in the world around me that don't look so good to me, and it really all came to a head for me. First, starting back in 2006 when I had a UFO encounter one night, and that sent me kind of searching down these paths again. Now, growing up, I've always kind of had a fascination with like occult-type topics or paranormal-type topics. So, this is stuff that I had already looked at to some degree or another, but just kind of more or less as a passing interest more than anything in the past. So it's not something I really delved heavily into. But when I had that UFO encounter in 2006, that sent me searching through the UFO field, looking for different research and answers as far as that goes. And it's amazing how many different branching paths this type of research takes. So from there, I started looking at all kinds of different occultic and esoteric ideas and different types of technological innovations and kind of the underground stream current of things and of these black budget technologies and things like that. And it's just astounding where it led me. This path led me in a lot of different directions that I really hadn't expected at first. So I like to tell people I kind of accidentally became an expert in occult philosophy because of that. I had never intended to really research any of that stuff. But
it's funny how life works out that way.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of those things. It's amazing how, these things kind of take that turn.
Sure.
But, well, from there, everything really came to a head for me in 2008 when my now 11-year-old son had a reaction to a vaccine, and that was a DTaP vaccine that he had and has since developed autism. And also, I also have a 7-year-old daughter who's on the autism spectrum as well. So I have 2 children on the autism spectrum, and that gives me a really direct insight into a lot of things involved with the condition that most people would not necessarily understand or see unless you live with it on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. So that really kind of set me in overdrive for researching these different topics. And lo and behold, when I got looking at autism and researching out autism to learn more about it, I discovered that there's this link between autism and the whole transhumanist movement. And it's just astounding. When I set out to write my book, this one's called The Autism Epidemic, Transhumanism's Dirty Little Secret. When I set out to write that book initially, I was just writing a book about vaccines. But once I started doing the research and I found this different direction things were going, I had to put pen to paper with it.
I personally had never heard of autism until a few years ago. It's not a condition that I remember ever being talked about. It certainly seems to be an epidemic, and it seems to be something that's distinctive to the times in which we're now living.
It's something that is a relatively recent advent in the history of mankind. The first use of the term autism came in 1911, and I believe it was from a Swiss doctor who coined the term infantile autism, and he used it to describe a set of symptoms that he noticed in a schizophrenic patient. But it wasn't until 1943 that the actual diagnosis diagnosis of autism came about as a thing by a gentleman named Leo Kanner. He's the one that put forth the groundbreaking work that identified autism as a separate condition from schizophrenia. So up until that point, if anybody had these type of symptoms, they were kind of classified as being schizophrenic, or what they would term pre-schizophrenic if they were children. So, and that's the other thing with this is these conditions were not diagnosed or even recognized as being even a thing until at the earliest, the late 1800s or early 1900s. These conditions never came about until then. They've never been recorded in the history of mankind up until that point. And that should be telling in and of itself.
Right. So for those that don't know, what are some common traits of autism? What sort of behaviors does it lead to?
All right, well, let's go ahead and define what autism is for people so they have a better understanding. Autism is what they call a spectrum disorder. So it means that anybody who's on this autistic spectrum, they could have all different kinds of symptoms and combinations of symptoms, and everyone who's on this spectrum has a unique convergence of these symptoms. So not everybody on the autism spectrum, it doesn't all look the same. It's not like the same set of symptoms for every person on the spectrum. So there are over 500 different symptoms and symptom combinations associated with autism. So there's a huge diversity of what goes on, but the core features of autism that help psychologists and medical doctors and stuff to diagnose it is things like having trouble with social behaviors, sensory processing disorders, lack of empathy, things of that nature, obsessive compulsive behaviors, things like that, or repetitive behaviors. A lot of people on the autism spectrum do something called stimming, where they'll just completely repeat doing the same action over and over again because it brings them some kind of a comfort. So this would be like hand flapping and things like that you would see. So there's different features like that are commonly associated with autism that kind of help define in the public mind what it means to be autistic. But the big part of it is they have difficulty with social interactions and things of that nature.
Right. So the prefix there, the AUT, we get words like automatic and author, and it denotes the self.
That is correct. It means actually isolated self or separated one.
So you go into yourself effectively and go inward.
Right. This is because they define autism being they kind of cut themselves off socially from what's going on around them. So they kind of seem like just in their own little world. So that's kind of how the term came about for autism. And there's also some other interesting root words that go along with this on a more esoteric line if you wanted to go there. But like such things as autumn or August, denoting the fall. So there's different esoteric aspects to this thing that go along with it as well. But sticking just to the technical terms of what autism is for now, that's one of the things that defines it. Is they seem to be cut themselves off from the outside world. They're in their own little world. They have hyper focus on things. They have obsessive compulsions about certain topics. That's a common feature among autists too, is that they tend to hyper focus on one particular thing, and this was evidenced like in the movie Rain Man. If you remember the movie Rain Man,
sure.
Like he had the savant skill of this math ability, and he would hyper focus on this. So that's one of the things that goes with it. Like they do tend to like to maintain order in things. Like they're notorious for they'll line up their toys in rows, autistic kids.
Yeah.
And it's part of the organizational part of the brain. And we could get a little more into this later on too, because there's different aspects of social intelligence and visual intelligence that go along with this.
Sure. Well, we can go esoteric, brother. That's what we're all about on this show, so no danger there. It really is an epidemic, though, because I feel things are getting to the stage where not only is everyone listening to this show going to know someone who's been affected by cancer, I don't think you can meet anyone now that doesn't have some family member or friend or associate they don't know that they know who's not being affected by cancer. I feel it's getting the same with autism too. Pretty much everyone you speak to has some kind of story about someone they know that's been affected by it. There is a case in my extended family.
Oh, absolutely. It's an epidemic, no doubt about it. And I don't know how they could not treat it as such, because there are some researchers out there who are saying that if something isn't done to reverse this whole thing, the autism rate by the year 2025 could be as high as 1 in 2 with some form of autism. And that's outrageous. People should be up in arms about that, because there's definitely some known causalities for this that they try to cover up, and they could do something to kind of stymie these things and make them stop.
So there's been a definite agenda in place for some time now to not only normalize the autistic condition, but to actually make it cool, in inverted commas, and fashionable. So I've seen Twitter hashtags and posts on Instagram and Snapchat and such, where people on the spectrum have been celebrating their condition. There's campaigns to celebrate, mental illness and conditions. It's giving young people the impression that these things are nothing to be concerned about, but they're to be embraced. And you've had celebrities like Kanye West and Mariah Carey and others revealing that they're bipolar, and they've been celebrating that. It's a different condition, of course, but it's still putting across the idea that mental conditions are the new normal. And you've got Greta Thunberg, of course, who's got Asperger's, apparently, so she's on the autistic spectrum, and she's being put out there as this activist that we should all admire and celebrate. And it all smacks of societal programming aimed, as ever, at young minds, because they're more malleable than those of us that have been around for a while. It's known, it seems to me, that this tidal wave of cases is only going to increase exponentially over the next few years, and they're preparing everyone for it. And never do you hear demands for research into what's causing so many cases of it. And it's like, why investigate the cause when we can just celebrate the symptoms? So this is something I've certainly noticed, making this whole thing cool and fashionable. Is that something that's come across your radar?
Oh, absolutely. I have entire chapters in my book devoted to that whole topic in and of itself. This is social engineering on a grand scale that they have going on. And it started out slowly with things like the whole autism awareness movement. And from autism awareness now, most people don't know this, but if you look, they actually devoted an entire website to this past April. Because April was traditionally, quote-unquote, Autism Awareness Month. Well, they changed it from Autism Awareness Month to Autism Acceptance Month. And the whole social engineering campaign behind that is to turn this whole autism awareness campaign into an autism acceptance campaign. So also from there, I mean, you could see how they like you've said, you could see the push for it in the mainstream media, how they're pushing to make this not only acceptable and normalized, but to make it a desired condition for people. And they're doing this through very subtle social engineering cues. And one of the ways that they do that is through our entertainment. If you take a look at some of the characters in TV shows, this displays what they call a rhetorical model of autism in many of these popular television shows. Like one in particular I could think of off the top of my head is The Big Bang Theory, where one of the main characters in it is that Sheldon Cooper, and he's one of your biggest typical stereotypical cases of what the mainstream pushes as autism. So that shows you that they're trying to make this normal and acceptable. And there's other aspects to this whole thing too that I find disturbing, because it's not just media or entertainment outlets that are pushing this. It's the mainstream scientific community. They're trying to make it look as if autism has been with mankind throughout all of history, and that it was actually a very important part of our evolution, and that it's also the next phase in human evolution. And this I find very disturbing.
And another thing regarding the normalisation of these things through popular culture and mainstream media in the UK has come from the soap opera known as EastEnders. Folk in the UK will be very familiar with this, but for overseas listeners, this is a very popular show. It goes out 4 times a week on the BBC, would you believe? And in it, you've got the character of the pub landlord, played by Danny Dyer, and his wife, who have recently discovered that their son is autistic. And recently they went to the doctors to get the news broken to them. And instead of asking the inevitable question, what could have caused this? Why is our son autistic? They've just meekly accepted the whole thing. And, you know, it's as if they're saying, oh, well, it's just the way it goes. You know, there's autistic kids everywhere. It's just bad luck. The BBC in EastEnders has previous when it comes to this. Whenever there's a social engineering agenda on the go, you can be sure that it gets weaved into the narrative of that show so that it's gulped down by the viewing public, millions and millions of them. But it always toes the official line on these things, and you'll never hear any of the characters asking any awkward questions about why these things are coming into play. I suppose we wouldn't accept anything other from the BBC, right? And it smacks of collusion between these different institutions and organisations. You've got the Hollywood film industry. They put out films like Forrest Gump in the 90s and Rain Man in the late 80s. And there was A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, which was, I think, the early 2000s. And all these films feature characters that are on the spectrum. So it's as if these films were put out in preparation for what was known to be coming. So you got Hollywood film executives in collusion with the medical industry, in collusion with the mainstream media, in, you know, normalizing all this stuff. And it's like everyone is working together on a socially engineered basis to bring this whole thing in. And it would appear that it's been known about for some time that this tidal wave of cases was going to be unleashed.
Right, and you could even look back even further in the entertainment and see even earlier examples of this. Go back to 1966, Star Trek, Mr. Spock. He's one of your rhetorical autism cases as well, as far as the representation in the TV show. So, I mean, you could go way back with this stuff. It's been known for a very long time.
Star Trek's got previous when it comes to this.
Right. Star Trek, you know, that is back in the 1960s when the Cybernetics group was doing some of the major research on this. So, I mean, there's a direct correlation there as well. And we could get into that because that's one place where this all stems from, this whole idea that autism could possibly be an engineered condition. This all stems back to the Cybernetics group that was formed in the early 1940s.
Sure, this was an output of the Macy conferences, and it was a precursor to transhumanism and the artificial intelligence smart grid of things that we've got today. It seems that way back in the 1940s, plans were being made to eventually bring all this stuff in, and there are even slight references to it in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, going back to 1932. So these individuals and these organisations have known about this for decades, it would seem, and cybernetics, as you say, was definitely the forerunner to today's transhumanist movement.
Oh, no doubt about it, and it goes way back. Like I said, I mean, you could see that back, being reflected in the writings of Huxley and others as well. But I mean, that one's a big tell right there if you're looking at Huxley, because he was directly involved in a lot of this stuff. But autism as itself, like I said, it didn't really come to be a diagnosis of its own until 1943 with the work of Leo Kanner. But it wasn't broadly recognized by the psychiatric or medical community until sometime in the 1960s. So that's the thing. From 1943 well on up into the 1960s, there were very few people that were actually diagnosed with autism because it was still all lumped together under schizophrenia. And that's one big part of the whole cybernetics group thing that people kind of missed out on when you're looking back at the whole history of autism. Because when they were studying this was being studied under the umbrella of schizophrenia. And there was a particular gentleman in particular who headed up a project looking at these things, and his name was Gregory Bateson, who was also in turn married to Margaret Mead. Are you familiar with Gregory Bateson?
Yeah, he was one of the founding members of the OSS, which became the CIA. And I think he was British, but he went over to America to head up that group. And as you say, he was married to Margaret Mead, who was a very prominent social scientist / eugenicist.
Yeah, it's amazing how all these things tie together, Mark, isn't it?
It really is.
The research you do, which, by the way, is brilliant with your looking at the different aspects of the music industry and the entertainment industry, it's amazing how all these same characters pop up in all these different areas.
Isn't it? Because Bateson and many of his cronies were very heavily involved in paving the way for the 60s counterculture, the LSD, psychedelic revolution, the hippie flower power thing. And a lot of those Macy conferences and the cybernetics groups and such were also involved in, aspects of all of that, the counterculture that played out in the 60s. So there is crossover. It goes into the music industry and it goes into the medical industry, just in this conversation alone.
Right, and that's also where this whole autism idea interrelates with it as well, because this is the time that they were actually doing these studies. And it's amazing how this all, stems together the way it does, because this is what was going on. That's when they were doing these studies on what they were trying to do was figure out what is consciousness and how does it work. And they were doing this by looking at different, what you would call psychiatric or neurological conditions at the time, most of which were kind of put under the general umbrella of schizophrenia. So they were trying to figure out, okay, how does the human mind work? And what is different about how a neurotypical human mind works as compared to one of these with one of these psychological conditions. And that's what they were looking at. What they were trying to do was to try to quantify consciousness and figure out how to control people. And that's actually what cybernetics is all about.
And this goes into LSD studies and MK Ultra, a lot of the experiments involved in that. And stuff that went on at the Esalen Institute in California. That was all about studying consciousness and how it could be enhanced with mind-altering drugs and such. So even more crossovers there. I mean, this whole thing ties into MK Ultra, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's, like I said, it's amazing how all these things interrelate at some level when you start looking at them, and all the same players keep popping up over and over again. But basically, this is what they were looking at. They were trying to figure out how to control the human mind, how best to control it. And when you look at cybernetics, what people don't understand about cybernetics is we could get into the definition of that a little better, because when people hear the word cybernetics, they're thinking in terms of robotics and things like that, right?
Yeah. Sure.
That's not what it is at all. That's the thing. It's misunderstood, and they've kind of obfuscated the meaning of cybernetics on purpose so that people don't really look into it. Cybernetics is the science of control of the animal and the machine. And that's, I believe, how Norbert Wiener, the guy who coined the term cybernetics, defined it. So cybernetics is the science of controlling systems. And that's what this is about, controlling systems. And they do this by looking at systems from a holistic standpoint rather than looking at constituent parts.
And this is exactly the basis of the Internet of Things that we hear about, which is on its way in, and in many cases is already here, where the idea is you have all these devices in your home, from your fridge to your kettle to your toaster, and they're all communicating with each other wirelessly, exchanging data, and it's all part of this massive system that you have in your home, which in turn is communicating all that data to who knows where else. This seems like the ultimate wish list of the controllers, to have these systems inside our own homes and have us connected into the smart grid with everything that we do. It seems like the whole completion of what they've always wanted to do is right here now.
Right. And the more data points you have to work with, the better the outcomes and the outputs of the data that you're using. So this is really tightening down the grip of control on people. Cybernetics is derived from an ancient Greek word, and the Greek for that is called kybernetes, which means literally either pilot or steersman. So this is, even encoded esoterically in the word cybernetics. This is what it's about. It's about controlling systems, and it's important that we look at it that they are looking to control systems from a holistic systems perspective, like the whole system, not just little constituent parts. And this goes completely opposite of how we're taught in our schools. Because when we go to school to learn, they break apart our subjects into these separate 40-minute classes. So you have like social studies class or science class, English, math. They break them up into these little 40-minute periods and separate whole ideas into little constituent parts. So they keep your mind kind of divided in this way. So you don't ever look at like whole ideas all at once. You're looking at little constituent parts of things. Well, cybernetics works completely opposite of this. They look at the big picture, whereas we're taught to look at the small picture. And that's part and parcel one of the reasons why people are so distracted and unaware of these things. Because most people, they're just living their life, just looking at the small picture that is their life, rather than looking at the big picture all around them. And this is done on purpose, and it's a form of social control, which derives directly out of the cybernetics movement.
I wrote a comment on somebody's Facebook thread today on related subjects that how Aldous Huxley would love to have been around in these times. Can you imagine everything that he was involved with in terms of paving the way for it? If he were alive today in 2019, watching all this stuff come to fruition, he'd be having multiple orgasms on the spot, I think.
I think so. This is all stuff that he helped to write into existence and bring into existence.
Exactly.
This is the thing. I mean, these people use very, very long-term planning. And that's another thing people can't seem to get their brains around, is that these people, they plan these things way in advance. They use 50 and 100-year plans.
That's right.
And that's something the rest of us, we don't think that far ahead. You know, we're lucky if we know what we're going to have for dinner tonight. So,
yep.
You know, when you look at it from that perspective, they have very detailed plans written out well in advance, and they put these things into play by putting little social cues and tells out into the different outlets so people could be conditioned into accepting it.
And they do it from generation to generation, so they display such incredible levels of patience that they don't seem to mind that many of them won't even be here when these plans come to fruition, because they just pass it off to their offspring and continue it through the generation. So the plans come to fruition over the course of several decades and, you know, different generations of the same families. That is a level of commitment that the rest of us just can't conceive of, because we don't have those kind of psychopathic mindsets in us.
Right, and not only that, our attention spans have been whittled down on purpose too, by design.
Of course.
And that's another thing. I mean, we're living in the YouTube generation. It's sad to say, but I mean, it's hard for me to even get my children to sit down and watch a 2-hour-long documentary or something like that. Mm. They just get bored very quickly because it's got to be something that's flashy and you know, moves from one thing to the next very quickly, because the attention spans aren't there, and that's all due to these technologies and stuff that we have today. The flicker rates of the televisions and the computer screens, the blue screens. This is all stuff that's designed to keep our attention spans short, and also to utilize these platforms for programming, and that's why it's called television programming.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that dynamic with my own kids, brother. I know all about that and low attention spans. I did a presentation at a conference in September in Amsterdam, which I've just released to YouTube, where I spoke about the science behind why pop music is now so bland and bloody awful to listen to. And it comes down to a recognition of these low attention spans that there are in young people. And so the algorithms, because it's artificial intelligence that is to a very large extent writing pop songs now, it's not even humans. The algorithms are determining where the melody and the hook needs to be in these songs and how often it needs to occur, in recognition of the fact that most young people can only concentrate on something for a few seconds. So every few seconds in a pop song, you have to have a new hook or a new stupid sing-along, what's known as the Millennium Whoop, where you get, you know, whoa, whoa, yeah, something stupid and bland like this, because it's what's required to keep the attention of the listener. And that's why the music all sounds the same, because it's using the same templates, and why it's just so insipid and vacuous and bland. But anyway, in what ways, in your view, is an autistic mind going to be better geared towards the AI, smart grid, transhumanist future that's incoming? Would you say that it's more of a machine mind that can be more suitably integrated into a technological society than a fully functional organic one?
Well, in a nutshell, yeah. I mean, what you said, that's kind of how it all works. The autistic brain is definitely more compatible to be merged with an artificial intelligence. And one thing people aren't aware of is a lot of artificial intelligence systems are actually modeled after the autistic brain. And this all relates to something called the VPR model of intelligence. And this is something that's more of a visual form of intelligence, and people on the autism spectrum have a high visual intelligence acuity, more so than a neurotypical person. So you're looking at what this is it's more of a highly visual form of intelligence. So this is something that the artificial intelligence utilizes. Like if you've ever noticed, if you go on, say you're filling something out for whatever reason, and you ever see one of those things that comes up on the computer that says, "I am not a robot," and you have to click on that?
Yeah. Captures.
And then they have you look at, to prove you're not a robot, they have you look at these different pictures. Like, one I was looking at the one day said, click on all the boxes that have stoplights in them.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's what this is all about. This is the visual programming of an artificial intelligence going on. They're using human data to help train the artificial intelligence to recognize these things. And that's one of the aspects of this going on, because this utilizes this VPR model of intelligence. And this is the same model of intelligence that's used to more successfully describe how autistic intelligence works as well. And they're using it to directly model artificial intelligences. So this is one way in particular where the autistic brain is more compatible for merging with artificial intelligence. And another aspect of it is people on the autism spectrum, they generally have this tendency to hyper-focus on things, like one particular thing, and they aren't very good with technology. And that's one key crossover that I see with it as well.
Is the incoming technological society something that concerns you anyway, regardless of the possible link with autism? Would this be something that you're likely to have questioned just on the basis of how it's changing human behavior?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And when I look at the whole transhumanist push for things, that has me very concerned, because by and large, the people that are pushing for this whole concept and idea are overlooking some very core spiritual aspects to this. And that in and of itself I find concerning. So even aside from the whole aspect of how autism relates to all of this, that in and of itself I find concerning too, because when it comes down to it, what they want to do is they want all our brains to be uploaded to the Internet of Things. And that's what they plan on doing. And it's not going to be a pretty situation, because individuality goes away, all your privacy goes away, the thought police become a real thing. It's a lot of disturbing aspects of this to look at.
Yeah. And it definitely does go to a spiritual level, because the way I see it, the push towards transhumanism is humans in their arrogance and their hubris wanting to be their own gods. It's like they're taking what the creator, the creative force, which you may choose to call God, has put into existence, and saying, we can do better than that. We can create our own version of this that can overwrite what the creator put into existence. Imagine that level of hubris in a human mindset. And yet that, to my mind, is what's going on. All of this is anti-God, it's anti-creation, it's anti-life. It's Satanism by any other name, because it's going against everything that is natural and inherent to creation, and it's putting something completely artificial in its place, or trying to. So for me, it goes very much into spiritual and metaphysical realms.
Oh, absolutely. And that's an aspect of it that is largely overlooked, like I said, by the people that are actively pursuing it. When it comes down to it, this whole concept of transhumanism ties all the way back to the ancient mystery schools of prehistory. And it also ties back in the Bible, for those that are more biblically inclined, to the great lie in the Garden of Eden. This is the great lie. Transhumanism is the great lie. You can be as gods, and that's exactly the great lie, and that's what they're pursuing.
Yeah, so you can look at this from the point of view of real-world science and, 3D physical reality and in a very analytical, logical way, or you can extend it to consider it from a spiritual viewpoint and an occult viewpoint. And I think those that are controlling this narrative love it when people just stick to the real-world scientific side of things and don't consider the occult overtones, because they're missing a huge part of the picture there, which slips under the radar.
Absolutely, and that's how the quote unquote magic works. Magic with a CK on the end of it, not just a C. It's a real thing, and they utilize it in conjunction with what they call science to do this. And what this is a complete inversion of the natural order. That's what they're looking to achieve with this. They're trying to completely invert the natural order and turn the natural world into a completely artificial world that they can control. Because when it comes down to it, they can't control nature. But if they turn nature into an artificial system, they could control that artificial system. And that's the whole goal of cybernetics, is total control of all these aspects of nature and of all these systems. They want to be God, and that's what it all comes down to. They want immortality, and they want total control of everything. So, they want to be God, and that's what their aim is, and it's a lie. And it's a lie that's going to come back to bite them very soon, in my opinion.
Yeah, we're on the same page with all of that, certainly. And for me, it also ties into the transgender agenda and all of this that we have going on, because that's another aspect of taking what is inherent to creation, male and female genders, duality, put into place by the Creator, and again saying, we can do better than that. We can have all these 50 different pronouns and, we can be non-binary and all of this. It's the same mindset that's behind these different agendas. We won't get into the transgender stuff on this show because that's a whole different can of worms, but it's just my thoughts on things there. So, just in that vein, Mark, I do have several chapters in the book that correlate autism along with the transgender movement and how transgenderism does directly tie to transhumanism. Oh, well, in that case, feel free to make some comments on it.
Okay, well, one of the ways that this ties over in with the whole autism epidemic is there's one particular model that they look at for explaining what autism is. It's called the extreme male brain theory of autism. And what this theory states is that the autistic brain has more masculine qualities than feminine qualities, and this relates to things such as like orderly structure and things of that nature, whereas the female brain is more considered to be more empathic per se, and like less keen on mechanical type things or organization. So that's one theory that has been put out by mainstream science to explain one of the things that is what the autism brain is the extreme male brain theory of autism. Now, concurrently with this, though, there was recently a story that came out and broke within the last year that the only transgender clinic in Great Britain for children, the Tavistock Institute, they failed to disclose. Oh, yeah, Tavistock involved with this, too. Like I said, it's amazing how all these things tie together.
I should do a drinking game. Every time Tavistock is mentioned, you take a drink. I'd have a lot of intoxicated folks listening to my shows, I tell you.
Absolutely. But the Tavistock Center, they failed to disclose that over 1/3 of the children that they were treating for these transgender issues were on the autism spectrum. Don't you think that's a bit of important information to report?
It's quite a coincidence, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, big coincidence there. So I actually have a whole chapter on this in my book where I question, now, is there a correlation between autism and gender dysphoria? Or is this more of an example of Tavistock taking advantage of people with a mental disability in order to push an agenda? And that's kind of a gray area. I can't really tell from any of the data that I've seen which of this could be, or it could just be both. So if you look at it from there, there's a correlation between autism and gender dysphoria. And for people who don't know, gender dysphoria is the term that they use in the new DSM manual to describe somebody who believes they're transgender, or who identifies as being transgender. And this has kind of been pushed out by the mainstream for the most part. This whole diagnosis, they don't like the term gender dysphoria, but gender dysphoria is a nicer term that they put in the new DSM manual, because there was a term that they used to use to identify this, and it escapes me. If you hold on one second, I can look up the term that it used to be called.
No worries.
Gender identity disorder. Okay. They used to call it gender identity disorder. And because it had the word disorder in it, they tried to make it more friendly by just calling it gender dysphoria. So you could see, the little social tell there, where they're trying to use the words have meaning game to make these things more acceptable and normal. So by changing it from gender identity disorder, from a disorder, to just gender dysphoria, it makes it more acceptable to the minds of the masses. And that's the thing. They still try not to even identify it as being a mental illness, which it's really in the DSM manual, and people could go look this up. This is the diagnostic statistics manual that all the medical communities and stuff of the world use to identify different psychological disorders and neurological conditions. So it's a mental illness. And like you stated earlier, this is the normalization and acceptance of mental illness in society. And people, will probably not react to that statement so well. But
it's the new cool.
Right. It's in the DSM manual. It's listed as a mental disorder, and I'm sorry, it is. Those are the facts. I mean, I'm not the one saying this, and I have nothing against anybody, who identifies as a transgender person. So it's just, I want them to be aware that they're being used for a greater social engineering campaign.
Well, that's right. I mean, any of these agendas that come out of these social engineering think tanks are never born out of concern for the groups in question. The transgender thing is not about helping and extending sympathy towards people who are transgendered. It's about exploiting them to achieve wider goals. And it's the same thing with autism. It's the same thing with any kind of minority groups that appear to be getting elevated and given a platform. It's always about exploitation of them. And just on the normalization front there of these conditions, just to relate a brief anecdote, I was at an event some time back where you had a bunch of rappers and poets that were getting up on stage. It was like an open mic freestyle thing, and they were just busting some verses, And this one girl got up on stage, and she started her little performance by saying, "I'm bipolar," and everyone in the crowd cheered. Isn't that a strange thing? If she got up and said, "I've just broken my leg," people probably wouldn't cheer. But they did, because there's been this societal conditioning to not only accept these conditions, but also celebrate them. So somebody gets up there and says, I'm bipolar. The natural response, I would have thought, should be one of sympathy and concern and regret, not cheering for it. Isn't that interesting how they've achieved that?
Right, and they have the same thing with Greta Thunberg. And she gets up, she has Asperger's syndrome.
Yeah.
So she's this big hero because, not only is she, standing in the face of the UN or whoever it was she was standing in front of, yelling, "How dare you" at them over this whole climate hoax thing. Yeah. But, also she is celebrated as, the victim. Of this victimhood thing, this whole celebration of this, the normalization of these things, of the mental illnesses and such. Right. It just blows my mind to see how people will, get up and cheer for this. Like this is a desired thing. Don't get me wrong, my heart goes out to anybody who suffers with these real medical conditions and these real psychological conditions.
Sure.
and we should encourage them to try to, to do great things because they are perfectly capable. But at the same token, we should not be celebrating the condition. We should be celebrating what it is they're doing, not the condition. So like somebody who gets up and says, I have bipolar disorder, that should not get cheered immediately. Okay, right. Well, what are you doing? You know what I mean? If they get up and they say, I cured cancer. Yay, that's something to cheer about.
Yeah, right.
And then as an add-on, and I have bipolar disorder. Okay, that's great. We feel for you. We're glad you were able to accomplish this despite the obstacles in your way.
Exactly.
But this is something completely different from that. This is social engineering on a grand scale. This is the normalization of these things and the celebration. You put it very perfectly. It's the celebration of these things. And this is not the way we should be going with this stuff. As far as the whole transgender issue, transgenderism is one step of the Overton window away from transhumanism, and that's where it's ultimately leading. This is a slow process that social engineers use to get ideas they want into the public mindset. It's called the Overton window. Now, what this is it slowly shifts what society will accept as normal or desirable by introducing more and more obscure or outrageous ideas. So right now, they've gone and shifted from, they started out with the gay rights movement and stuff like that, gay marriage, all of that. So homosexuality was normalized. Okay, people have come to accept homosexuality as a normal thing in society now. So now the next shift in that is this whole transgender push that's going on right now. And this will ultimately lead to transhumanism. And that's going to be your next big push through all of this, is the replacement of people's biological body parts with implants or different kinds of prosthetic devices, whether necessary or not, because that's one of the approaches that they're taking to this whole idea is, okay, if it's acceptable for a disabled person to get a prosthetic implant or, a prosthetic limb, then, shouldn't a person without the disability also be privy to this medical technology as well? And that's where the line kind of grays on a lot of this stuff. And there are real research papers and policy papers out there talking about this. And I assure you, the medical community is getting ready for this. I've seen a document from the Alberta Heritage Foundation that talks about how they're going to change the way that the healthcare model works now from a model of, how did they put it? I'm trying to think of exactly how it was worded. Well, regardless of how it was worded, I'm just working from memory here. Basically, the whole premise behind it is it goes from treating illnesses, from that mindset of treating illnesses, to pretty much augmentation technologies for people. And that's what they're looking to shift the healthcare industry from. So this stuff's coming, whether people are ready for it or not. The policy think tanks are thinking about this stuff and writing it down and putting out papers about it already. And it's been going on for a long time now.
That's right. And there are people whose full-time jobs it is to sit around and devise these strategies. They don't have any other distractions in life. That's what they do. So that's how all this stuff gets put into place. I do want to mention the video to Beyonce's Single Ladies at this point. I have mentioned it in previous shows. I did a great show with Lennon Honor going back a few years where he drew attention to the symbolism in this video. So this song came out in 2009 and you got Beyonce flanked by two dancers and she's got this robotic prosthetic arm. For no apparent reason. It bears no relation to the lyrics of the song, but she's sort of interacting with this robotic arm. And it's right there in everybody's faces, being subliminally absorbed. And that, to my mind, was in preparation for all of this 10 years ago. So people might want to go back and watch the video to Beyonce's Single Ladies on YouTube to see what I'm talking about. With regards to Greta Thunberg, what they've done with her is very sly, because she's got Asperger's apparently, so she's on the spectrum. And now any criticism of her message about climate change, which, as you said earlier, is a hoax, and provably so. We're being played for suckers on that one. But the argument now becomes about her and her condition. So if you have any objection to the things that she's talking about, like there's no scientific foundation to them, that gets brushed to the side, and instead it becomes an attack on her condition. And you get called, a hater and a bigot because you're making a victim of this poor girl that's bravely going out there with Asperger's. So it's very clever the way they've done that one. And it's similar to the way that those of us who can think for ourselves and do our own research and don't need to be told how to think, where we've been able to establish a link between autism and vaccines. Now, there's this label of anti-vaxxer that gets thrown around, and it's out there with conspiracy theorist and Holocaust denier and anti-Semite and homophobe and all these catch-all umbrella terms that just get hurled at people who ask questions about mainstream narratives. So people that question vaccines now are being demonized in mainstream society, and it's quite sinister the way they've turned that around and created this anti-vaxxer label for us all, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And they are very clever, these people in control at the top of the power structure. They know what they're doing. They're highly intelligent, and they utilize these different social engineering tools against us.
Yes, they're full-time jobs, like I said.
Right. So they think of these things, and, they even, a good example I could cite that is just recently within the past year or two or so, they came out with the moniker, quote unquote, fake news. Do you remember that? They came out with this term fake news, and now, online their mission is to battle what they call fake news. So that involves if somebody posts something that's contrary to what the mainstream narrative says about something, they have these quote unquote fact checkers that put up this article rebuking what was said. And now they're just outright taking material down and censoring people. It's getting to be that bad, claiming that they're fighting fake news. And also I've seen recently where I believe it's one of the intelligence agencies in the U.S., I think it's the CIA, if I'm not mistaken, has now a dedicated division to fighting, quote-unquote, fake news online. So it might be the Department of Defense now that I'm thinking about it. I forget which three-letter agency it was, but they're doing that now. They have a designated department just to combat what they claim fake news. So this is censorship coming to town. They're going to try and shut us all up. I mean, it's just a matter of time now. They're rolling it out heavily. You could see where YouTube is now changing their policies come December 10th, where, they're going to start taking channels down that don't meet their criteria. So, if they don't deem them being what's the term? Commercially viable,
yeah,
I think is the term that they use.
Yeah.
And that's a very ambiguous term. That could mean anything. That's very subjective. That's pretty much giving themselves free rein to take down whatever they feel like if it doesn't agree with the narrative they want to put out. So, I mean, this is very real stuff going on. And you got to wonder, why are they going to such pains to shut us up? If there's nothing to, the whole vaccine autism link, if it's just a couple of screwball conspiracy theorists out there saying this stuff,
right?
What harm is it then? If they could show that, the scientific credibility that this is not actually in fact going on, then, why are they so worried about it? And they are worried about it, Mark. They're definitely worried about it.
Sure.
They're coming up with all kinds of different strategies now to try and shut up what they quote the anti-vaxxers. So, it's something that they're really worried about, and there's a reason they're worried about it. People are seeing it in epic numbers. I mean, as much as they want it to go away, there's a definite correlation between vaccination and autism, and they can't tell me otherwise. I saw it with my own two eyes. I watched my then 3-month-old son almost die in front of my eyes as an adverse reaction to this vaccine, and then later develop autism. I watched it happen in front of my eyes. That changes a person. That's why I get so heated about this whole topic. And anybody who wants to debate me any day about vaccines, I'm willing and I'm able. I'll show them the accredited, the research papers, the peer-reviewed documents that show that they know damn well that these things are doing harm to people, and they're doing nothing about it to stop it.
Right. What did you make of that movie that Robert De Niro put out, the Vaxxed movie? He caught a lot of flack for that in the mainstream. He was kind of demonized for going against the official narrative on vaccines. Now I'm trying to figure out what that was all about, because De Niro is obviously a system player. He wouldn't have had a 50-year career in Hollywood if he wasn't down with certain agendas and, you know, playing ball and stuff. So I wonder if that was a genuine case of him becoming a bit of a loose cannon and a maverick and speaking from his own mind rather than sticking to an agenda. Because I think he has an autistic son himself, doesn't he? Which would obviously affect his viewpoint on things. What did you make of that whole affair?
Okay, well, my take on that movie, I thought it was a very good movie. It was kind of, you know, softball in the evidence and stuff it put out. Don't get me wrong, it was a very good movie, and it really made a huge impact. But I think De Niro was kind of, you know, I think he was genuine in wanting to get some of this information out. But I also think that he's so of the controlled nature. They told him, okay, here's what you could do and here's what you can't do. This is what you can talk about and this is what you cannot talk about. So they kind of kept it very much, you know, what I would call kind of a softball type of a movie. Whereas, you know, I'll tell you in no uncertain terms, vaccines are a soft kill weapon. Okay? I will say that. And that's not something that they would come out and directly say on that type of a movie. And I don't think you'll ever see it in any kind of a mainstream movie where someone will tell you that. This whole technology of vaccination has been weaponized. It's been weaponized against us. And in my view, it's eugenics, and that's the core to what's going on with vaccines. And that's why they're trying to mandate it. And that's why they're just shoving it like at you in all directions. You've got to think, if they're offering you a medical procedure for free, exactly. Think about this.
Exactly.
Think about this. Yeah. You're the product.
It's about all you can get for free on the medical industry. They'll charge you for everything else. Now, why would they offer this for free? Out of genuine concern for your well-being? Really?
Right. The health and wellness of the masses? I don't think so. They don't care. They could not care less about the health and well-being of the masses. When you're looking at an industry that will outright charge you $100 for a Band-Aid in an emergency room, like you're telling me they're giving away this multi-billion-dollar research and development product for free, right? There's a reason for that.
Let's try and uplift things a bit then as we get towards the end of this conversation. Let me start by asking you what sort of support or encouragement you've received in response to your work, and what sort of stuff has come forward to validate the claims that you've made. Just focusing on, you know, the positive aspects of your research rather than any flack that you might have copped for putting it out there.
Well, honestly, Mark, I've been really stunned at the amount of positive feedback I've gotten from people about it. You wouldn't believe the people that contact me and say, hey, thank you for writing your book. My cousin or whatever has autism, and we knew it was the vaccines that caused it, but my relative, you know, the mother wouldn't believe it and this and that, and, you know, the information you're putting out is helpful, and it's astounding. I get an overwhelming amount of positive feedback from it. I get very little negative feedback. So, I mean, that tells me that, you know, there must be some solid ground that I'm standing on, that I'm writing about these things. And I cite peer-reviewed sources and stuff in my work. I don't just look at, say, a blog post or something and quote that like some people would do. This is all fact-based stuff that I'm putting out. I mean, there's real legit research behind it. Sure. So it's kind of one of those things where if people want to take issue with it, don't look at me. Go back and look at the sources that I'm pointing out to you. This is where this says this. You know, vaccines, you know, and stuff like that tie directly to this. I put, you know, the different sources and stuff in my bibliography of where I got a lot of this information. People could go look it up for themselves. And I encourage anybody, do this research for yourself. Don't listen to what I have to say. Don't believe what I have to say. Go look for yourself and come to your own conclusions.
As you were saying earlier, if the likes of you and I, with what we both put out on our respective work, were just a couple of crazy unhinged nutters just spouting a load of nonsense, then we'd have been shut down long ago. Nobody would look at our work. Nobody would bother to get in touch with us. There's got to be some grounds to it. Otherwise, we wouldn't still be out there doing it, right?
Absolutely, and that's the whole thing in and of itself. If we were just a couple of, crazy conspiracy theorists, as they call us, then what harm would there be in us speaking? Why would they be so desperately trying to shut us down? Yeah. And that's the thing that gets me. It's like, people will actually resonate with the work that we do. Like, people resonate with my books that I put out. They contact me and say, hey, thank you for doing what you're doing. And it's really kind of humbling for me, Mark, because I'm not the type of guy who would ever expect anything like this. I never intended to be an author or a researcher or a public speaker or anything of the sort. I never had any plans like that in my life. It's just a leading I've had from God to do this, and that's just my personal experience. I am a Christian. I consider myself a Christian, and it took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that God would lead me down this path, and this is the direction He wanted me to go. But this is what I'm doing now, and it's really striking a chord with people, and it is humbling for me because, like I said, I never had any intention of doing any of this type of stuff. I never thought in a million years that I could. So
yeah, indeed. What is your hope as to where things go from here? What is the most realistic best case scenario that you can see playing out?
Okay, well, here's where I'm coming from. I don't want people to walk away from any of this stuff with having no hope, because we definitely have hope. Because here's what we need to do, and here's what we can do. We need to, first of all, not tolerate the censorship. So if they're going to censor us on different platforms or whatever, we need to find new platforms to get this information out. We need to keep this stuff out, in the public view. We need to talk about it. We need to keep this information moving forward, because this information could be very empowering for people, and it's important that it gets out there. So first of all, we need to fight the censorship the best way we can and try to do what we can with what we have. Now, if this involves like doing more conferences or something in different areas, that's something I'm willing to do. Like we just recently, this past month, had Shoot the Moon NYC, where you and I both were at, and it was a good turnout, really good turnout for that. And people are receptive to the information and hungry for it. So if we have to do more things like that, like physically go out to the public to get this information out, which I'm thinking the way the internet censorship is going, that might be the way we need to go in the future. That's what we need to do. Secondly, I would also like to encourage people that, we need to stand up to this whole mandated vaccine thing. The whole right to, the consent for, this whole thing. We need to acknowledge that we need to consent to this, like this whole thing, and we're not consenting to it. So we need to acknowledge that they can't do this to us. We should stand up and say no. We have the right to say no. This is an invasive medical procedure. So if we could do this and stop this whole vaccine agenda, and we could reverse this autism epidemic, then we have definite hope in the future. Because if we just let them roll over us with these, mandates and stuff with this vaccination bit, this is the line in the sand. This is the true line in the sand. So if we let them do this to us, we're telling them, okay, our bodies belong to you. You can do whatever you want to us. That's what it is. This is about a metaphysical form of consent. This goes way beyond just, a whole physical thing. Once again, you reach into a whole spiritual plane with this. So we need to tell them no and stop their vaccine agenda in its tracks. And if we do so, we could reverse this autism epidemic. And if we could do that, then their whole house of cards crumbles and they can't pull off this whole control grid that they want.
Exactly. I mean, the work that we do is partly putting information out to empower people and let them know what they're up against, but a big part of it also has to be finding ways to throw spanners in the works and put obstacles in the path of these agendas and, screw things up for them, make things difficult. And that's a great way of doing it, just withdrawing our consent. We've got to find ways of just disrupting their plans and throwing them back in their agendas several years and several decades.
I agree with you 100%. And I think a good example we could see of this online right now is the whole Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself thing that's been going on. Right. Have you been monitoring that on social media?
Yeah, I've seen that slogan is just cropping up everywhere in all different countries.
If we can do that with some of these other topics, this would be huge. This would just implant the ideas in the minds of the public that, this is something that could be stopped just by bringing awareness to it. And that's the thing. The more that it gets out there in the public view, the more people begin to question it. Because, I think pretty much everybody has seen that whole meme now that Epstein didn't kill himself. And I really don't personally know anybody that accepts that the guy committed suicide. So what really happened, nobody knows for sure. But pretty much the consensus is that he didn't commit suicide now. And that's a far cry from how it was just a few years ago with, if you would have said that back, say, going back 10 years or something, if something like that happened, they'd call you a conspiracy theorist and, you're a nutter and, that's it. And they wouldn't think of anything more of it. But now it's just caught on like fire in social media. And it's been just going far and wide. And people have, readily accepted the idea that the official narrative is nonsense. So,
well, that's right. I mean, I often muse on whether certain things that we get to hear about weren't supposed to get out there, like the Jimmy Savile scandal of several years ago. I wonder whether that should have been kept under wraps, and it was kind of an accident that it leaked out, and now everyone knows that Jimmy Savile, who was connected to the British royal family and politicians and all this and other celebrities, was a paedophile. Some will say that that was a controlled narrative and it was always supposed to leak out, but I wonder if it was. And all the Jeffrey Epstein stuff seems to be getting out of hand as well. So little things like that can make a big difference to causing people to question the nature of the world that they live in. Because if certain things are possible, like if you can get someone to question the official narrative of 9/11 and accept that there was collusion on the part of the American government, the mind is automatically going to go to, well, if the government would do that, what the hell else have they been up to all these years? What the hell else would they have no problem with doing to the general public? So these are definitely useful processes. And what you said there about channels being taken down and information that's up there on the cloud could disappear at any moment. This is why books, physical paper books, are of such value. That's why I like writing books, and you've put yours out. And these are very valuable assets that are still going to be around if the cloud does get taken down. So your book on this subject is The Autism Epidemic, Transhumanism's Dirty Little Secret. Let people know where they can get that. And also, have you written other books as well?
Yes, that's available on Amazon or at pretty much any other fine book retailer at this point. I also wrote a book called The Alchemicaltechrevolution, Fulfilling Ancient Esoteric Agendas Through the Use of High Technology. And that one is also available through Amazon or at any other fine book retailer. If anybody wants to contact me directly, I could be reached at alchemicaltechrevolution@gmail.com, or people could feel free to check out my Facebook page, which is called Files from the Conspiratorium. Unfortunately, it is inactive at this time because I started reaching a larger audience. Facebook has locked me out of it. So I haven't been able to post anything new on there, but there's still about 5 years worth of really good information on there for people to look at. So if people want to check that out, that'd be great too. I will be working on my third book here very soon, so look for that probably sometime 2020.
Sure. All right, brother. Well, great work you're doing. I applaud you for it, and you're on the right side. You're fighting for the right side, definitely. And, it's the only way to be. So thank you for coming on today.
This is just a I'm picking up vibrations.